Join me now to weigh in on it all, representing Texas's 4th Congressional District, Congressman Pat Fallon. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me. So, Congressman, I'll say it again. What happened on January 6th was very bad. People shouldn't have broken the law. They shouldn't have stormed the Capitol. And I'll keep saying that. But we need to be clear here. This was not an insurrection. And it's interesting. No one was charged with insurrection. Wouldn't you need insurrectionists for an actual insurrection?
Well, Stephanie, thanks for having me on. Happy New Year. And stop making sense, will you? I mean, I was nodding my head the whole time on your monologue. It was great. I was there too. These reporters, what a joke to say that they have PTSD. I mean, why don't they go and serve in Afghanistan or Iraq or in the military when you're actually under fire and you might have maybe you can credibly say rather that you're suffering from PTS. I mean, it's ridiculous. I was right there and it was a riot. That was it. And you so adroitly pointed out that these leftists conveniently forget about the $2 billion worth of property damage from the Antifa and BLM riots, as if that never happened. They whitewash it. It's just they have amnesia on that. But one riot that took 4 hours, and it was in one building, they just obsess over. This is January 6 2.0, January 6 3.0. We just have to move on. And one last thing about what you just said. Was anybody charged with sedition? I asked the FBI director that. Was anybody found with a firearm in the Capitol? No. No sedition either. You do not overthrow the greatest republic history has ever known with flagpoles, mace, and a stolen podium.
Yeah, and then we heard Congresswoman Liz Cheney lie in that interview saying that Trump never told the rioters to go home. Actually, he did. Maybe it wasn't fast enough for her likings, but it was also President Trump who suggested calling in the National Guard before January 6th, and that no one else seemed to support that. And what about all the tip-offs that maybe there was something that was going to happen on January 6th, and all these members who are crying about it now didn't seem to care then?
Well, let's be really honest, and let's go beyond honesty with your audience and your great viewers and talk about let's be candid and frank. Of the roughly, I don't know how many people were there that day, 200,000 folks to protest, there were probably 200 that went there with the intent of mayhem and chaos. 99.99% did not. And that's what they don't want to focus on. Let's talk about the preparedness of the Capitol and the security. It's interesting that the Sergeant at Arms refuses to release all communications related to the preparations for January 6th. Why? What are they hiding? And the fact that they now claim that the threat's never been higher today than it ever has been, well, then has our security improved? Because there are 400 officers under their optimal strength, number one, and there were 200 suggestions to improve security. They only have documented that they've done 61, and the IG, for that matter, gave them 104 strong recommendations, and only 30 of those have been implemented. And that all lays at the feet of the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, and at this point, as you're pointing out, that the Capitol is no safer today than it was a year ago. And so the Democrats who are so concerned about it had all this time to make sure all of these new safety protocols were implemented, and none of that's happened because they've been so busy on the partisan attacks against President Trump and his inner circle.
Right, and that's what they want to talk about January 6th. All right, well, how about the fact that of all our Capitol Police officers, I really was under the impression that most of them were trained in less than lethal, considering their job, considering that they have to deal with political protests far more frequently than any other law enforcement agency in the country. And you would be shocked to know, roughly speaking, and I'm going to paraphrase the numbers, there's about 1,700 Capitol Police officers, or at least ideally that's the level, give or take 100 or so. You know how many are trained in less than lethal? About a dozen. That is obscene. We need to correct that. That should be mandatory training for all Capitol Police officers. And Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats are fixated on January 6th. Well, I want to talk about January 20th, because that'll be the one-year anniversary of Joe Biden's presidency. And look what we have. We have, darn near double-digit inflation, the highest inflation we've had in 40 years. Our prestige around the globe is, suffered dramatically. China and Russia are saber-rattling and on the march. And we just, in COVID, we've had more deaths this year than in 2020. So it's been an utter disaster this far.
Yeah, well, the Democrats don't want to talk about that. That's why we're seeing them foaming at the mouth, breathlessly talking about January 6th, just a couple of days before this anniversary. That being said, we watched this clip of some of the reporters. Obviously, they're assisting in this, and they're talking about all the trauma and PTSD, and obviously you called them out on it. It's pretty ridiculous and embarrassing, but that's what they do. And part of me kind of feels bad for these reporters. It's like, seek help. You should seek help if you're feeling this way. Like we worry about you.
Were they in Saigon? Were they in Fallujah? I mean, it really gets to my goat because I served in the military and I was never in combat. So I was fortunate in that regard. But to sit there and have a reporter say because they witnessed some folks, screaming very loudly and waving flags and entering a building they shouldn't have and trespassing, PTSD, that's a stretch.
Yeah, it's a bit of a stretch. But again, they don't want to focus on these big issues like inflation and everything else. And all of those who committed crimes on January 6th, the trespassing and everything, they should be held accountable. But we want to make sure that they're treated within the law. That is, that they're not being overpunished. And obviously, we see what the Democrats are doing and even how law enforcement is treating them. And it seems like we have a two-tier justice system. So if you are a Black Lives Matter rioter and protester, a lot of these people were slapped on the wrist. And then if you happen to be at the Capitol that day, I mean, they literally know what you had for breakfast. I mean, they were going through people's bank records and everything else.
Yeah, well, the FBI director Ray admitted that of the roughly 700 folks that entered that building, most of them didn't hurt anyone or damage any property. So that's a trespassing charge. Why are these people in jail for over a year for trespassing? I mean, that's usually a ticket. And then you pay a fine. You're not in prison for a year. And then we don't know the conditions that we do know of were horrid. And what about, I thought we had habeas corpus. I thought we had equal protections under the law, and it doesn't seem we do. And you mentioned if you were an Antifa or Black Lives Matter protester that got arrested, the soon-to-be Vice President Kamala Harris bailed you out of jail.
Yeah, and I also thought it was very ridiculous and offensive when we've heard some of these lefties compare January 6th to 9/11 or other just horrific events in history when clearly that's not there. And if you look at what happened on that day, the only person who died was an unarmed woman, and her name was Ashley Babbitt. She was shot by an officer.
Stephanie, to sit there and compare January 6th to 9/11 is the ultimate. That's hyperbolic at an astronomical level. I mean, we lost nearly 3,000 Americans to murder that day, one of the worst days since really Pearl Harbor. And then to compare this, and as you adroitly pointed out as well, that one of the protesters, Ashley Babbitt, was the only one that directly lost their life to what happened that day in those events. And the left never wants to acknowledge that. They don't want to acknowledge the 25 people that lost their lives to the Antifa and Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. They don't want to say the name David Dorn, a hero. 34-year police captain. They don't want to venerate him. They don't want to paint murals on him, about him. They want to forget all about it, and it's disgusting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Congressman, thank you for breaking it all down. We appreciate it.
Thanks. Happy New Year. God bless.
Happy New Year.